I never imagined that one day I would stand in the middle of my living room, watching flashing red lights bounce off the windows, while firefighters rushed into my house carrying heavy equipment. I never imagined I would hear the sound of my husband screaming in agony or my daughter-in-law shrieking in humiliation, their voices tangled together in a symphony of betrayal. And I certainly never imagined that I, the woman who had devoted 30 years to this family, would be the one holding the secret that turned their lust into a public scandal. But that night it happened, and it all started with a single tube of lube. When the first firefighter pushed the door open, his boots echoing against the wooden floor, I felt like my entire body was trembling, not from fear, but from an odd sense of justice. Behind him came two more, one carrying a large metal case, another with a heavy cutter strapped to his shoulder. The air smelled of rubber and smoke from the truck outside. My neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, their faces pressed against the glass, their cell phones already raised. This was no longer a private matter. It was about to become a neighborhood spectacle. "Where are they?" the captain asked, his voice brisk, professional. Unaware that he was about to stumble into the most grotesque and ironic scene of his career. I pointed upstairs, my hand steady, though my heart raced. "In the bedroom," I said. My voice sounded almost calm, as though I were giving directions to a tourist. Inside, however, I was burning with a mix of rage, vindication, and something dangerously close to satisfaction. The firefighters rushed up the stairs, their boots pounding like drums. Seconds later, the house erupted with shouts, curses, and an order that chilled the air. "Call for backup! We need extraction tools here!" I leaned against the wall, my breath shallow. And that's when I heard it. The sound that would etch itself into my memory forever. My husband's voice, panicked, furious, humiliated. "Please do something! Get us out of this!" he screamed. Right after, my daughter-in-law's voice cracked in hysterical sobs. "I can't move! It's burning! It's burning!" The firefighters tried to stay professional, but even they couldn't hide the disbelief in their tones. "I've never seen anything like this," one muttered. Another answered, "We'll have to cut the frame. There's no other way." The neighbors outside whispered, their muffled voices seeping through the glass. "What's happening? Is someone hurt? Why are they bringing the cutters?" But they didn't know yet. They didn't know that upstairs, entangled in the most shameful position imaginable, were my husband and my son's wife, my daughter-in-law. My name is Margaret. I am 57 years old. For 3 decades, I believed in the sacredness of marriage, in the loyalty of family. I cooked, I cleaned, I supported, I endured. And in return, my husband gave me betrayal so grotesque that I still struggle to find words strong enough to capture it. But that night, when the firefighters pried open the door and rushed inside, when they gasped and recoiled at what they saw, I knew that destiny had handed me the stage to reveal the truth in the cruelest spotlight possible. Do you know what it feels like to love someone for 30 years, only to discover that they see you as nothing more than a shadow in their house? Do you know what it feels like to raise a son, only to watch his wife, the woman who calls you mom, crawl into your husband's bed behind your back? That's the kind of pain that doesn't just cut, it annihilates. And yet, as I stood in that living room listening to the chaos upstairs, I asked myself, who was really the victim now? Was it me, the woman they had humiliated in secret? Or was it them? Exposed in front of uniformed men, neighbors, cameras, and soon the entire town. The answer was obvious, but it didn't make the sight any less surreal. The banging intensified, metal against wood, groans of effort. Then a scream. My daughter-in-law's voice again, high and desperate. "Don't let anyone see me like this! Please cover me!" she begged. But her words were drowned out by the captain's blunt command. "Ma'am, you need to calm down. We're getting you out safely." Safely. What a word to use in a moment like that. There was nothing safe left for them. Not their dignity, not their lives. not the image of respectability they had tried to maintain. Every second dragged them deeper into disgrace. I closed my eyes, flashes of the past hitting me like shards of glass. Our wedding day, 30 years earlier, when my husband had promised to love me until death. The day my son brought home his girlfriend, shy and sweet-looking, the one who would later become my daughter-in-law. The Christmas dinners, the family photos, the long nights I stayed up waiting for my husband to come home, all those memories twisted into something grotesque as the truth unfolded above my head. And then came the first thud of the cutters, biting into the bed frame, followed by a groan from the firefighters straining with the effort. The air filled with the smell of scorched metal. I imagined the scene, their bodies glued together, writhing, skin burning from the chemical reaction, faces contorted not from passion but from shame. And I realized the irony. It was my hand that had put them there, my decision, my plan, my revenge. But the firefighters didn't know that yet. Neither did the neighbors. Neither did my son. To them, it was a bizarre accident. To me, it was justice. I turned my gaze toward the window, where the flashing lights painted the night red and blue. My neighbor Linda's wide eyes met mine through the glass, her mouth forming silent questions. I gave her no answer. Let them wonder. Let them speculate. The truth would reveal itself soon enough. And when it did, when the final piece of metal was cut and my husband and daughter-in-law were carried out of that room by uniformed men, when the cameras clicked and the whispers spread like wildfire, the entire world would finally see what I had known for months, that the people closest to me had turned into my worst enemies. So I ask you, if you were in my place, if you discovered your husband in bed with your son's wife, would you have stayed silent? Would you have allowed them to keep living their lie? Or would you, like me, have chosen to make their secret the most public humiliation of their lives? This is not just the story of betrayal. It is the story of how a single woman, stripped of love and respect, turned her pain into the sharpest weapon of all, truth, exposed under the brightest lights. And if you think the screams you just heard were shocking, wait until you hear how I discovered their affair, how I set my plan in motion, and how I made sure that the glue of their sins would bind them tighter than they ever wished. Long before that night of flashing sirens and horrified screams, the first cracks in my marriage had already begun to show. At first, they were subtle, almost invisible, the kind of details you might brush off as paranoia. A late arrival home, the faint whiff of perfume that didn't belong to me, a smile that never reached his eyes. I wanted to believe they were coincidences. After all, we had been married for 30 years. You don't throw away 3 decades of trust because of one lipstick stain you convince yourself must have been a mistake. But deep down, the doubt had begun to eat me alive. It started with his schedule. My husband, Richard, had always been a creature of routine. For years, I could predict the sound of his car pulling into the driveway at exactly 6:15, the way he would drop his keys on the kitchen counter, the sigh of relief as he loosened his tie. But somewhere around last spring, his schedule started to shift. At first, he claimed it was extra hours at work, a new project that demanded late nights. I believed him, because belief was easier than suspicion. But the excuses became more frequent, and the hours stretched longer. One evening, I waited at the dinner table until the candles had burned halfway down and the food had turned cold. He stumbled in after 10, muttering about a last-minute meeting. I leaned in to kiss him, and that's when I smelled it. Something floral, expensive, a fragrance I didn't own. He pulled away quickly, too quickly, as if afraid I might catch more than just a scent. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my chest tight. I thought of all the years I had stood by him through sickness, through financial struggles, through the sleepless nights of raising our son. Had all of it meant so little that he could carry another woman's perfume home without shame? I tried to push the thought aside, but my body betrayed me. The next morning, When I picked up his jacket to hang it, something slipped out of the pocket. A small foil packet, unmistakable in its shape and sound. My hand shook as I picked it up. A condom. We hadn't used protection in over a decade. My throat closed, my vision blurred. I wanted to scream, to confront him right there, but instead, I shoved it back into the pocket, as if returning it to where it belonged could erase the truth. But it didn't erase anything. It only magnified the gnawing certainty. My husband was hiding something, and it wasn't just long hours at work. The universe has a cruel way of confirming what you fear most. A week later, on a rainy Tuesday, I drove past the downtown cafe, where I knew my husband sometimes grabbed coffee on his lunch breaks. I hadn't planned to check on him. It was just on my way back from the market. But something told me to slow down. Through the window, I saw him. He wasn't alone. Across the table sat a woman with long brown hair, her hand resting casually on his arm. My chest seized, but when she turned slightly, my blood froze. It wasn't just any woman, it was my daughter-in-law, Claire. The world tilted on its axis. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Claire, the girl I had welcomed into my family, the girl I had cooked for, helped with rent when she and my son were struggling, the girl who called me Mom at Christmas. She was sitting there, laughing softly, her hand on my husband's arm like she owned him. I pulled the car over, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. I wanted to burst through the cafe door, to drag them both out by their collars, to scream until every patron in the place knew what kind of disgusting betrayal was happening before their eyes. But I didn't move. I sat there, soaked in the realization that the two people who should have respected me the most had conspired in silence, right under my roof. The betrayal felt like acid burning through my chest, but I told myself maybe I was mistaken. Maybe I had seen wrong. Maybe a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law are meant to doubt themselves when reality is too cruel. I drove away with tears streaming down my cheeks, repeating the same lie to myself. There must be an explanation. That night, Richard came home late again. I asked him casually about his day, and he answered with rehearsed indifference, his eyes avoiding mine. "Just meetings," he said, his voice flat. I stared at him across the dinner table, studying the man I had married, trying to reconcile the face I knew with the stranger I was seeing. For the first time in our marriage, I realized I didn't know him anymore. The paranoia grew. I began to notice everything. The way Claire's cheeks flushed whenever Richard was around, the way his phone lit up with messages at odd hours, the way conversations between them lingered a beat too long. Once, at a family gathering, I caught them exchanging a look so quick and sharp it might have been invisible to anyone else. But I saw it. It was the look of people sharing a secret, and I knew I wasn't part of it. One night, unable to sleep, I wandered into the laundry room and began folding clothes he had left in the hamper. When I reached into the pocket of his trousers, I felt paper, a receipt. I unfolded it, my breath catching. A hotel charge dated 2 nights earlier. I traced the numbers with my finger, the total burned into my mind, and then I saw the note written at the bottom in neat, feminine handwriting. "Until next time, R." I nearly collapsed onto the floor. My stomach churned, bile rising in my throat. I wanted to scream, to tear the receipt into shreds, but instead I clutched it, pressing it against my chest like it was proof of my own sanity. The next morning, I confronted him lightly, testing his reaction. "Were you at a hotel this week?" I asked, my voice steady though my hands trembled under the table. His fork froze halfway to his mouth. He laughed, too loud, too forced. "Of course not. Why would I be at a hotel?" Why indeed? The lie rolled off his tongue so easily, I almost admired the practice behind it. But my admiration turned to disgust when I realized how often he must have lied to me before. Still, I stayed silent. I told myself I needed more proof because the enormity of what I suspected was too monstrous to accuse without certainty. But the certainty was already there. festering in my gut. It haunted me as I watched him leave the house, as I saw Claire's car parked down the street, as I noticed her lipstick shade smudged on a glass in my kitchen after she visited when my son wasn't home. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the voice inside me whispered the truth. You are being betrayed, and not just by your husband. You are being betrayed by your own blood, by the woman who married your son and now shares your husband's bed. That night I lay awake, listening to the sound of Richard's steady breathing beside me. I turned my head and studied his face in the dim glow of the streetlight filtering through the curtains. For 30 years, I had loved that face. I had trusted it. Now all I saw was a mask, a disguise for the lies he carried. My chest ached with the weight of betrayal, and yet I didn't cry. I felt something colder, sharper. I felt the beginnings of resolve. Because when you realize that the people closest to you are capable of destroying you, you have only two choices. You can crumble under the weight of their betrayal, or you can rise above it, sharpen your pain into a weapon, and prepare for the moment when truth will be the only thing left standing. And as I drifted into restless sleep, clutching the hotel receipt under my pillow like a talisman, I knew which choice I would make. If the first signs of betrayal felt like shadows creeping at the edges of my vision, the next stage was the moment those shadows solidified into undeniable shapes. It wasn't just my imagination anymore, not just suspicions clawing in the dark. The world around me began to echo my doubts, as if even the walls, the neighbors, the very air could no longer keep their secret hidden. It started one afternoon when I stepped outside to water the small rose bushes by the front porch. Our neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, was crouched by her mailbox, sorting through envelopes. She glanced up at me, then quickly looked down again, her face flushed. Something in her manner struck me as odd, so I forced a smile and asked, "How are you, Carol? Haven't seen you in a while." She hesitated, shuffling her mail before replying too quickly, "Oh, fine, just busy." But her eyes darted toward my driveway, where Richard's car often sat parked at odd hours lately. That night, as I carried the trash to the curb, Carol finally approached me. Her voice was hushed, almost conspiratorial. "Margaret," she said, "I don't want to meddle, but I've noticed, well, your husband, he's been over at Claire's place when your son isn't home." My body went rigid. I gripped the trash bag so hard the plastic split, spilling apple cores and coffee grounds onto the pavement. I forced myself to bend down and clean it up, as if keeping my hands busy could keep my heart from shattering. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice trembling. Carol nodded, her expression pained. I didn't want to say anything, but it's happened more than once. Her curtains were open last week, and I saw him leaving very late. The world tilted. For days, I replayed Carol's words, each syllable cutting deeper than the last. It wasn't just my paranoia, others had seen it. My humiliation was no longer private. It was visible to the very people who lived down the street. Still, I wanted proof that couldn't be brushed aside as gossip. So one morning, while Richard was in the shower, I took his phone from the nightstand. My hands trembled as I unlocked it, knowing the risk, knowing if he caught me, the facade of trust would crumble completely. At first, there was nothing. He was cautious, deleting messages, clearing call logs. But in his photo gallery, hidden inside a folder marked Receipts, I found what I needed. A blurred picture of Claire, her hand resting on his thigh, the corner of a hotel bed visible behind her. My vision swam, bile rising in my throat. I snapped the phone shut before I could collapse. The betrayal was no longer speculation. It was documented, pixel by pixel. But fate wasn't done twisting the knife. Later that week, I stopped by Claire's house to drop off a casserole, an old habit I had never quite abandoned. She opened the door, her smile a little too bright, her movements a little too stiff. As I stepped inside, I caught sight of a man's jacket draped over the back of a chair. It wasn't my son's, it was Richard's. The scent hit me instantly, the same cologne he wore every morning. My pulse pounded as Claire babbled excuses about how busy she had been, how grateful she was for the food. She avoided my eyes, her cheeks flushed, her fingers trembling as she took the dish. And then, from upstairs, I heard it. The creak of footsteps, a door closing softly. Richard was there, hiding like a guilty teenager in the house of his son's wife. I forced a smile so brittle it could have shattered. "Tell my husband dinner will be ready at 7, I said calmly. Her face went pale. The look in her eyes confirmed everything. I left without another word, the air around me heavy with the stench of betrayal. But the universe had more cruel confirmations in store. A few days later, as I passed the living room, I overheard a hushed voice drifting through the slightly open back door. Richard's voice. I froze, my breath catching. He was on the phone, speaking in a low tone, the kind he used only when he didn't want me to hear. "Don't worry," he whispered. "She'll never suspect. You mean more to me than she ever did. You make me feel alive again." Every word was a knife to my chest. My vision blurred as I leaned against the wall for support. I wanted to burst in, to snatch the phone from his hand, to scream until the entire neighborhood heard. But instead, I listened, my nails digging crescents into my palms. Then I heard the final blow. "I love you, Claire." He said her name, my daughter-in-law's name. I nearly collapsed. My knees buckled, and for a moment I thought I might faint. But I held myself upright, biting down so hard on my lip that I tasted blood. I retreated silently to the kitchen, gripping the counter until the trembling passed. That night, I stared across the dinner table at Richard. He chewed calmly, oblivious, as if the walls hadn't just echoed his betrayal back to me. My fork clattered against the plate, but he didn't even glance up. I realized then how little I meant to him, to both of them. Days blurred together, each one carrying a new humiliation. My son, blind in his devotion to Claire, praised her constantly. "She's been amazing, Mom," he said one evening, "always helping, always supportive." I wanted to scream that she was supportive, yes, supportive in my husband's bed, but I swallowed the words, choking on silence. I began noticing more. Claire's lipstick shade, smudged on a glass that Richard had used, the faint scent of her shampoo lingering on his jacket, a strand of long brown hair caught in the collar of his shirt. Each discovery felt like a hammer pounding another nail into the coffin of my marriage, and yet, somehow, the world seemed to conspire against me, making me appear like the paranoid wife, the jealous mother-in-law. Once, during a family gathering, I caught them exchanging a glance, so fleeting and sharp it could have been missed by anyone else. But I saw it, the spark of shared secrecy. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but the truth screamed louder than my denial. The worst came one Saturday afternoon. I returned home early from errands, my arms laden with groceries. As I approached the house, I heard laughter from inside. Not just laughter, hers high and lilting, followed by his, deeper, more intimate than I had heard in years. I froze on the porch, my keys trembling in my hand. Through the thin crack of the curtains, I saw them. Her perched on the arm of the sofa, his hand resting casually on her knee. My son wasn't there. It was just the two of them, comfortable in the space I had built, shameless in the home I had filled with memories. I staggered back, the groceries spilling onto the ground, oranges rolling across the driveway. I clutched the porch railing, gasping for breath, the world spinning. I wanted to burst inside to confront them, but something held me back. Some small, cold voice whispered, "Not yet, not until you're ready to burn them both to the ground." That night, alone in my room, I opened the drawer of my nightstand and pulled out the receipt from the hotel, the foil packet from his jacket, and the image of Claire from his phone that I had secretly forwarded to myself. I laid them out in front of me like weapons, proof of my sanity. My hands trembled, but my resolve hardened. I was no longer just a wife betrayed. I was a woman gathering evidence, each clue another nail in the coffin they were building for themselves. The whispers of neighbors. The jacket left carelessly on Claire's chair, the phone call where he said her name, all of it converged into a single truth. They were not just betraying me, they were mocking me, confident in their secrecy, sure that I would never dare to expose them. But they were wrong. Because even as my heart bled, even as my soul felt crushed under the weight of their deception, another part of me, colder, sharper, stronger, was beginning to awaken, and that part of me was ready to fight back. By the time the third wave of betrayal hit, it was no longer just suspicion gnawing at me in silence. It had become a cage, a suffocating prison built from whispers, glances, and denials. What hurt most wasn't even their secret affair. It was the way they made me feel like I was the crazy one, like my instincts were nothing but the ravings of a bitter, jealous old woman. That was the cruelest cut of all. It began during an ordinary Sunday dinner, one of those traditions I clung to like a lifeline. I'd spent hours cooking, laying out roast chicken, potatoes, and apple pie, trying to create the warmth that once bound us together. When my son and Claire arrived, they filled the house with forced laughter, the kind that ricochets against the walls but never reaches the heart. Richard sat beside me, distant, his eyes always drifting toward her, as if pulled by a magnet he could no longer resist. At first, I tried to ignore it. I asked my son about his work, listened as he talked about projects and promotions, and smiled as though the world wasn't crumbling beneath my feet. But then Claire leaned across the table, her hand brushing Richard's wrist far too casually, far too familiarly. My chest tightened, heat rising up my neck. "Careful, Claire," I said, my voice sharp despite my effort to stay calm. "You'll spill the wine." She froze, then laughed lightly, a sound laced with mockery. "Oh, Margaret, you worry too much. It was nothing." But I saw the flicker in her eyes, that tiny flash of triumph, as if she had just scored another invisible victory in a war only the two of us acknowledged. Richard glanced at me then, and instead of shame, his eyes carried warning. Silent, ruthless warning that told me to stay quiet. Later, while clearing the dishes, I overheard my son teasing Claire in the kitchen. "You've got Mom all riled up again," he chuckled. Claire's reply came smooth as poison. She sees things that aren't there. Maybe she's just lonely. I pressed my hand against the wall, my body shaking, lonely. They were painting me as a paranoid, needy fool, and my own son was laughing along. That was the beginning of my isolation. Each family gathering after that grew colder. If I tried to draw attention to their closeness, I was met with eye rolls and sighs. My son would say, "Mom, you're reading into things again." Richard would scold me with a glare sharp enough to silence me. Claire would smile sweetly, dripping false innocence, while beneath the table her hand grazed his thigh. I felt myself shrinking, my voice disappearing. I began to question my own sanity. Was I imagining it? Were the hotel receipts, the perfume, the phone calls all fabrications of my desperate mind? Or had they managed to twist reality so well that I no longer trusted my own eyes? The breaking point came on Richard's birthday. I had planned a surprise party, invited neighbors and colleagues, baked his favorite chocolate cake. The living room was filled with balloons and chatter when he walked in, feigning astonishment. Everyone sang, laughter bubbled, glasses clinked. For a brief moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, the nightmare would pause long enough for me to feel like his wife again. But then Claire arrived. She slipped in late, wearing a red dress that clung to her like sin. When she leaned in to hug Richard, her lips brushed dangerously close to his cheek. Too close. My stomach twisted. The neighbors noticed, too. I caught their side glances, the whispers behind half-hidden hands, and yet no one said anything. During the toast, Richard raised his glass. "To family," he declared, his arm around Claire as if she were the guest of honor instead of his daughter-in-law. The room erupted in cheers, but I stood frozen, bile choking my throat. After the cake was cut, I escaped to the kitchen, my hands trembling as I washed dishes that didn't need washing. From the doorway, I heard Claire's laugh, light and flirtatious, followed by Richard's low murmur. A neighbor muttered, "They're awfully close, aren't they?" The words sliced through me, confirming my deepest shame. Everyone could see it, but no one would defend me. That night, when the guests left and the house fell silent, I confronted him. My voice shook, but my words were steel. "Richard, I know it's her." For a moment, he didn't speak. Then he slammed his glass onto the counter, shards scattering across the floor. "You're insane," he spat. "Paranoid, delusional. Do you want to ruin this family with your fantasies?" His words struck harder than his fist ever could have. Delusional. That was how he framed me, how he kept me trapped. By twisting my grief into madness, he stripped me of credibility, of dignity. The next day, my son called. His voice carried the same rehearsed pity. "Mom, Claire told me you've been suspicious. Maybe you need to talk to someone. You've been under a lot of stress." I bit my tongue until blood filled my mouth. My son, the boy I had raised with sleepless nights and endless sacrifices, was defending her, defending them. I realized then that they weren't just betraying me in secret. They were erasing me, replacing me with a caricature of the jealous, unstable wife and mother. And it was working. Friends stopped calling, neighbors avoided my gaze. Even my son began to keep his distance. One evening, I walked past the living room and froze. Richard and Claire sat together on the couch, their heads bent close, whispering. When I entered, they jumped apart like children caught stealing candy. My son walked in seconds later, and Claire immediately stood, rushing to hug him, her performance flawless. Richard smiled as though nothing had happened, and I stood there, invisible in my own home, my heart pounding with rage I could no longer contain. That night, alone in the bathroom, I stared into the mirror at a woman I barely recognized. My face was pale, my eyes hollow. I had become a ghost haunting the edges of my own life. But beneath the exhaustion, beneath the despair, something else stirred, something fierce and unyielding. Because if they thought they could erase me, if they thought they could paint me as delusional while they destroyed everything I had built, they were wrong. I pressed my palms against the sink, my reflection hardening. They had taken my trust, my dignity, my son's loyalty. But what they didn't know was that they were giving me something far more dangerous, a reason to fight back. And I promised myself, with the quiet certainty of a woman who has nothing left to lose, that I would. By the time the fourth storm hit, I was running on fumes of sorrow. The betrayals had stacked up like bricks, heavy and relentless, until I felt my own body buckling beneath the weight. I was isolated, humiliated, treated like the lunatic of the family. I had been stripped of my authority as a wife, dismissed as a paranoid mother-in-law, cornered into silence at every gathering. And finally, I reached the edge of myself. One night, after another family dinner, in which Claire smirked her way through conversations while Richard hung on her every word, I shut myself in the bathroom and locked the door. I sank to the tiled floor, pressing my forehead to my knees, and I cried the way I hadn't cried since childhood, ragged, desperate, as though my ribs might crack from the sobs. 30 years of loyalty, 30 years of trust, 30 years of giving myself away piece by piece, and this was my reward, to be erased by the people I had given everything to. I thought about leaving, about packing a single bag, slipping into the night, disappearing to some quiet corner of the world where their whispers couldn't reach me. I even opened the closet and touched the worn leather handle of my old suitcase. My mind wandered to fantasies of starting over somewhere anonymous, where no one knew Margaret, the foolish woman who lost her husband to her daughter-in-law. But then I looked around the bedroom. my bedroom, and rage surged through me. This was my house, my walls, my furniture, my life built with my own sweat and sacrifice. Why should I be the one to leave? Why should I vanish while they carried on, smug and victorious in the ruins of my dignity? The thought made me sick, and I collapsed onto the bed, my body trembling with exhaustion. My tears soaked the pillow, but exhaustion eventually dragged me into a restless half-sleep. I dreamed of being trapped in a burning house. Flames licking closer as familiar voices laughed somewhere beyond the smoke. I woke in the dark, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding as if it might burst. For days I stumbled through the motions of life like a hollow shell, cooking meals I didn't eat, folding clothes I didn't care about, smiling at neighbors with lips that felt like paper. My body was alive, but my spirit was dead. Every sound in the house, the creak of the stairs, the vibration of his phone, the giggle of Claire when she called my son, stabbed me like a needle until I felt more like a pincushion than a person. The humiliation deepened one afternoon when I walked into the kitchen and found Richard and Claire whispering over coffee. They froze when they saw me, guilt flashing across their faces for only an instant before it hardened into defiance. Claire gave me a pitying smile, like a nurse humoring a senile patient. Richard muttered, "Don't start, Margaret, not today." Not today, as though my pain had to be scheduled, slotted neatly into their calendar of deceit. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. My voice was gone, strangled by months of gaslighting. And then came the moment, the smallest discovery, the tiniest object that shattered my despair and ignited the ember of something far stronger. I had gone into Claire's guest room one evening to gather sheets for the laundry. On the nightstand, half hidden beneath a tissue box, was a small cardboard package. I picked it up absent-mindedly, thinking it was lotion, but when I tilted it, my breath caught. It wasn't lotion. It was an empty box of personal lubricant, the same brand Richard had once tried to bring into our bedroom years ago, back when we were still clinging to the tattered edges of intimacy. My hands trembled as I lifted the box closer. Empty. Recently used. The realization cut through me like lightning. This was no longer suspicion, no longer whispers in the dark. This was tangible evidence left behind carelessly, arrogantly, as if they believed they were untouchable. I dropped the box back onto the nightstand and stumbled backward, my heart hammering against my ribs. For a moment, the room blurred, my knees giving way. I collapsed onto the bed, clutching my chest, gasping for air. This was the lowest point, the absolute bottom of the pit. I had caught them in every way possible, smells, looks, receipts, photos, and now this, proof of their intimacy left lying around like trash. I wept until my throat ached, until my body shook with the violence of grief. I thought of all the years I had shared a bed with him, all the nights I had whispered promises of forever, all the sacrifices I had made so he could live without worry. I thought of the nights I had stayed awake rocking our son to sleep, never once imagining that the woman my son would someday marry would become my rival. But then, through the tears, something else began to form. A thought, a spark, a seed of fury that grew stronger with every sob. If this was what they had chosen, if betrayal was the bed they wanted to lie in, then perhaps I could make that bed their prison. I rose from the mattress, my face streaked with tears, but my eyes blazing with something new. I picked up the empty box again, studying it, turning it over in my hands. A plan whispered to me, dark and sharp. My despair had birthed resolve. My grief had become fuel. They had turned me into a ghost. But now, I would become their nightmare. That night, as Richard slept soundly beside me, oblivious, I lay awake, my mind racing. I imagined every way I could make them suffer. I imagined exposure, humiliation, destruction. My tears had dried, leaving behind only steel, and in that moment I realized something profound. They had taken everything from me, my dignity, my family, my peace. But in doing so, they had given me the most dangerous weapon of all. They had given me nothing left to lose. The next morning, I rose with a calmness that startled me. I showered, dressed, and made breakfast as though nothing had changed. But inside, I was no longer the broken woman sobbing on the floor. I was something else, something sharper, colder, stronger. When Richard kissed Claire goodbye in front of me later that day, as if daring me to protest, I simply smiled. Let him think I was defeated. Let Claire think she had won. They would never see it coming. Because the moment I found that empty box, the war had begun. The day after I discovered that empty box, I moved through my home like a ghost with a mission. The despair that had weighed me down for weeks had burned itself out, leaving a clarity I had never known before. My heart was no longer a cracked vessel leaking grief. It was a furnace, forging something sharp and merciless. If they wanted to betray me, if they wanted to make me the fool in my own family, then I would be the one to script their downfall. The idea came to me in a flash, almost too outrageous to consider. But the more I turned it over in my mind, the more it made sense. Their affair was a secret built on desire, on stolen moments and whispered lies. What if I could take that very desire and transform it into their undoing? The empty box of lube was more than evidence. It was a blueprint, a tool, and in my hands, it would become the trap that would bind them, literally, in the shame they deserved. I began my preparations quietly, carefully, as though rehearsing for a performance in which failure was not an option. The first step was simple: purchase. I went to the drugstore in the next town over, one where no one knew me, where I wouldn't risk whispers traveling back to the neighborhood. I walked down the aisle with calm precision, selecting a tube identical to the one I had found in Claire's room. The cashier barely looked at me, sliding the box across the counter without a second thought. For her, it was an ordinary transaction. For me, it was the beginning of justice. When I returned home, I didn't go to the kitchen or the living room. I went straight to the basement, a place Richard rarely bothered with. There, in the dim light, I opened the package, my hands steady. I took out the tube and carefully drained its contents into the sink, watching the slick substance swirl down the drain like the last remnants of my patience. Then, with a deliberate calm, I replaced it with the substance I had chosen: industrial strength adhesive, colorless and thick, purchased from a hardware store earlier that morning. It was the kind of glue used for construction, strong enough to fuse wood and metal, dangerous enough to burn skin. I filled the tube carefully, making sure the nozzle was clean, the seal intact. To any careless eye, it looked untouched, brand new. As I pressed the cap back on, I whispered to myself, "You wanted this bed. Now you can lie in it forever." The following days felt strangely serene. I went about my routine with a composure that unnerved even me. Richard noticed nothing. If anything, he seemed emboldened, more brazen in his deceit, as though he believed I had finally accepted my role as the silent, broken wife. Claire, too, seemed bolder, her smiles sharper, her whispers more careless. They believed they had crushed me. They believed I had surrendered. And that belief was their blindfold, guiding them straight into my trap. I kept the sabotage tube hidden for 3 days, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Patience became my armor. Every time I saw Richard's phone light up with a message from her, every time I watched Claire flutter around my son with practiced sweetness, I reminded myself, soon. Every humiliation, every smirk, every dismissive glance would be repaid in full. On the 4th night, I slipped into Claire's guest room while she was out shopping with my son. My hands didn't tremble as I placed the altered tube back on her nightstand in the exact position where I had first found the empty box. I smoothed the sheets, adjusted the tissue box, making sure everything looked untouched. My heart hammered, not with fear, but with anticipation. It was done. All that remained was to wait. The waiting was excruciating yet thrilling. I found myself listening for footsteps, for whispers, for the telltale creak of the stairs. I felt like a hunter who had set the snare and was crouched in the shadows, waiting for the prey to stumble into it. And stumble they did. The following evening, Richard announced he'd be working late again. I nodded, hiding my smile behind a sip of tea. Hours later, as the house fell silent, I heard it. The faint creak of the back door, the muffled shuffle of feet, the low murmur of voices drifting down the hall. My chest tightened, but I remained still, every muscle locked in patience. Upstairs, a door closed. Soft laughter floated down, muffled but distinct. My nails dug into the arm of the chair as I imagined them reaching for the tube, blind in their desire, blind to the trap waiting in their hands. Minutes passed, then came the first muffled yelp. My head snapped up, ears straining. Another sound followed, sharper, more frantic, the unmistakable pitch of panic. "Richard, what's happening? It burns!" Claire's voice was high, cracking with fear. "Don't move, don't, God, it won't!" His voice broke into a groan, guttural and desperate. I pressed a hand to my mouth, not to silence a scream, but to stifle a laugh. The trap had sprung. They were caught, fused by the very desire that had destroyed my family. The noises grew louder, thrashing, cursing, sobbing. Their panic was a symphony, each note sweeter than the last. I sat in the living room, the shadows flickering around me, listening as though it were music composed for my ears alone. For months, I had endured humiliation in silence. Now, it was their turn. And yet, I didn't rush upstairs. I didn't confront them immediately. Instead, I waited, letting the glue do its work, letting their terror ferment into desperation. Every cry was a reminder. This is what betrayal costs. When the thuds and cries finally reached a fever pitch, I picked up the phone. My voice was calm, measured, almost detached as I spoke to the emergency dispatcher. "Yes," I said. "There's an accident in my home. My husband and another woman. They're stuck. They can't separate." The dispatcher hesitated, confused, but I gave the address with precision. When she asked for clarification, I replied evenly, "Just send the fire department. You'll understand when you see it." As I hung up the phone, a strange calm settled over me. I was no longer the victim weeping in the dark. I was the architect of justice, the orchestrator of their downfall. I rose from the chair and walked to the window, where the first flickers of red and blue lights began to appear in the distance. My reflection stared back at me from the glass, pale, tired, but resolute. For the first time in months, I felt powerful, because I knew that what was coming was not just revenge, it was revelation. Their secret, once hidden in whispers and shadows, was about to explode under the brightest lights imaginable. And I would be there, calm and unshaken, to witness every second of their disgrace. Let the world see. Let the neighbors whisper. Let my son's illusions shatter. The storm was here, and I was no longer its victim. I was its eye. When the firefighters were still minutes away, the house had already become an inferno of screams. I didn't need to see the scene upstairs to know what was happening. Their voices painted the picture vividly, the frantic rustle of sheets, the pounding of fists against furniture, the guttural mix of agony and shame. They were caught, glued together in the very act that had destroyed me, and there was no escape. At first, I simply listened from the foot of the stairs. The sound of them writhing filled the air, echoing down the hallway like some grotesque opera. Claire's sobs were sharp, piercing, carrying the high-pitched desperation of a trapped animal. Richard's voice was lower, raw, with pain and fury, shouting orders she was too frantic to follow. Their panic was almost musical, each note resonating deep in my chest. For months I had endured silence while they mocked me in whispers. Now their screams were my vindication. I climbed the stairs slowly, one hand trailing along the banister, savoring every second. When I reached the bedroom door, I paused, letting their chaos bleed through the wood. I could have stayed there forever, listening. But something inside me demanded more. I wanted to see them. I wanted to etch their humiliation into my memory so it would never fade. I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The scene before me was grotesque, surreal, sheets tangled around limbs, skin slick with sweat and adhesive, their bodies fused together at the worst possible place. Their faces were masks of horror. Claire's mascara streaked down her cheeks as she clawed uselessly at her own skin. Richard's forehead glistened with sweat, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. Their eyes snapped toward me the moment I entered, widening with a mix of fury and shame. "What did you do?" Richard roared, his voice cracking. "What the hell did you do to us?" I stepped inside calmly, shutting the door behind me with a soft click. My hands didn't tremble, my breath didn't falter. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind 100 times, and now that it was here, I felt nothing but clarity. I asked softly, tilting my head. "I didn't do anything. You did, both of you. I gestured toward their entangled bodies. "This is what betrayal looks like." Claire sobbed harder, her body shuddering against his. "Please, help us, call someone." "They're already on their way," I interrupted. My voice was cool, detached, but my eyes burned with fury. "The fire department, the neighbors, anyone within earshot will know soon enough. You wanted secrecy. Tonight you'll have an audience." Richard thrashed, trying to move, but the glue held firm. He winced in pain, his bravado cracking into desperation. "You're insane, Margaret. Do you hear me? Insane. You'll ruin everything." I took a step closer, my shadow falling over them. "No, Richard. You ruined everything. You ruined 30 years of marriage. You ruined our family. You ruined me. And now you've ruined yourself." For a moment, silence stretched between us, broken only by their labored breathing. I studied their faces, memorizing every twitch of shame, every flicker of panic. It was better than I had imagined. Claire finally lifted her tear-streaked face, her voice trembling. "Please, Margaret. I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you." Her words ignited something in me, a flame so hot it seared away the last remnants of pity. I crouched so my eyes were level with hers, my voice dropping into a whisper. "You called me Mom. You sat at my table. You smiled in my son's face while you crawled into my husband's bed. Don't you dare say you never wanted to hurt me. You destroyed me with every choice you made." Her mouth quivered, but no words came. She buried her face against Richard's shoulder, sobbing into the man who had enabled her betrayal. Richard glared at me, his eyes bloodshot. "If you don't help us, Margaret, this will haunt you. You'll be responsible. Do you understand? You'll go to prison for this." I straightened, laughing softly, the sound startling even me. "Prison? For what? For leaving a tube on a nightstand? No, Richard. You glued yourselves together with your lies long before tonight. I just gave you a mirror." He opened his mouth to retort, but a sharp knock at the front door silenced him. The first responders had arrived. The wail of sirens cut through the night, joined by the murmur of gathering neighbors. Claire whimpered, panic flooding her face. No, don't let them in. Please, Margaret, please. I'll do anything. Just don't let them see me like this." I turned toward the window where red and blue lights painted the walls in fractured colors. My reflection looked back at me, calm and resolute. I had been invisible for so long, but tonight, the world would see me through the flames of their disgrace. I looked back at them one last time. Richard's face was twisted with rage, Claire's with shame. "The firefighters are coming up," I said evenly. "When they walk through that door, you'll beg them for help, and when they tell the story later, they'll say they've never seen anything like it. Your names will be whispers on every street corner. Your faces burned into every neighbor's memory. That's the justice you earned." Richard growled, his voice hoarse. "You think this makes you strong? You're pathetic, Margaret. Pathetic." I leaned in close, my lips near his ear, my voice steady as stone. "No, Richard. What's pathetic is a man who destroys his family for a few stolen moments. What's pathetic is a woman who betrays the very mother of her husband. Me? I'm not pathetic. I'm free." The pounding of boots echoed up the stairs. The door rattled as fists pounded against it. "Fire department, open up!" I stepped back, my eyes locked on theirs. "Time's up!" And with that, I turned the knob, preparing to let the world witness what I had already seen. The grotesque truth of their betrayal, exposed under the harshest light imaginable. The pounding on the bedroom door grew louder. "Fire department, we're coming in!" one of the men shouted, his voice firm, clipped, urgent. I stepped aside, my heart steady, my breath controlled. Behind me, Richard and Claire thrashed against each other like trapped animals, their whimpers turning into guttural moans of desperation. The knob twisted, the door creaked, and then the room filled with the heavy boots and flashlights of men who had no idea what they were walking into. The first firefighter stopped in his tracks. His flashlight beam froze over the bed, illuminating the tangled spectacle of skin and sweat. For a moment, silence hung in the room, broken only by Claire's sobbing. Then came the low whistle of disbelief. "Jesus Christ," the man muttered. Another firefighter stepped forward, his face hardening into professional focus, though I caught the flicker of shock in his eyes. "We'll need cutters," he said to his team, "and gloves. This isn't going to be simple." Claire shrieked, pulling at the sheets to cover herself. "Don't look, please, don't look," Richard roared in frustration. "Don't just stand there, get us out of this." The captain's jaw tightened. "Sir, you need to calm down. We're here to help." But their eyes betrayed them. They had seen plenty in their line of work, burns, car wrecks, overdoses, but nothing like this, nothing so grotesque, so humiliating. And soon their astonishment would become stories they'd share at every firehouse dinner for years to come. I leaned against the wall, arms folded, watching with quiet satisfaction as they unpacked their tools. The sharp clang of metal cutters echoed in the room, mixing with the muffled sobs of my daughter-in-law. Every sound was a note in the symphony of justice I had orchestrated. Downstairs, I heard voices, the murmuring of neighbors gathered outside, the click of phones recording, the rise and fall of gossip traveling like wildfire. The flashing lights from the trucks painted the walls in violent red and blue. My humiliation had been private, suffocating me in silence. Theirs would be public, carved into memory by every witness in sight. Then came the twist fate had been holding back. The front door slammed and a familiar voice echoed through the house. My son. "Mom? Dad? Claire? What's happening?" His footsteps pounded up the stairs, confusion lacing every syllable. For the first time since the plan had begun, my chest tightened. I hadn't anticipated this, his arrival at the exact moment when everything was unraveling. The firefighters glanced at me as the footsteps drew closer. I said nothing. I let fate take its course. The door burst open wider, and there he was, my son standing in the doorway, his face pale in the flashlight beams. His eyes darted from the tools to the uniforms, then landed on the bed. He froze. His jaw dropped. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. The room was suspended in silence, except for the ragged breathing of the guilty. "Dad?" His voice cracked. Then, "Claire?" The color drained from his face as the reality settled in. His wife, his father. Entangled, exposed, Claire let out a strangled sob, reaching a trembling hand toward him. "Please, it's not what it looks like." But the lie died on her lips. There was no way to explain this. Not with firefighters cutting through the bed frame. Not with her body glued to my husband's. Not with the stench of betrayal so thick it suffocated the air. My son stumbled back, his hand gripping the doorframe as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. His eyes brimmed with tears that refused to fall. "How could you?" he whispered. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of 1,000 screams. Richard tried to speak, his voice booming, desperate. "Son, listen to me. It's not— Don't you dare!" my son shouted, his voice breaking as it ricocheted off the walls. He pointed at him, at her, his whole body shaking. "Don't you dare say a word." The firefighters kept working, their faces set in grim professionalism, though the tension in the room was palpable. Metal screeched against wood, sparks flew, and the air thickened with heat and shame. I turned toward my son, my voice calm but steady. "Now you see the truth," I said. He looked at me then, truly looked, as if seeing me for the first time in months. His lips trembled. His eyes filled with the dawning realization of what I had endured in silence. The final cut came with a loud crack, and the bed frame gave way. The firefighters moved quickly, lifting sheets, prying apart the mess of furniture, but the adhesive held stubbornly, their bodies still fused together. The captain sighed, muttering under his breath, "This is going to take hours." Claire wailed. Richard cursed. My son stood frozen in the doorway, his face carved with betrayal, and then, as if the gods themselves demanded full humiliation, a flash went off. One of the neighbors had slipped inside, phone raised, recording. "Get out!" Richard roared, his voice cracking. But it was too late. The evidence was already captured, destined to spread through every whispering corner of the neighborhood by morning. The captain barked an order, shoving the neighbor out, but the damage was done. My son collapsed into the hallway, covering his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking. I wanted to reach for him, to comfort him, but I knew this was his battle to face. He had to process the devastation of discovering that the two people he trusted most had destroyed his world. When the firefighters finally maneuvered Richard and Claire onto a stretcher, still fused, still whimpering, the room was thick with the smell of sweat, adhesive, and disgrace. They carried them out past the flashing lights, past the gawking neighbors, past my son who refused to look at them. The crowd gasped, murmurs rippled, phones clicked again despite the officers shouting for order. I followed slowly, stepping out onto the porch as the night air washed over me. The neighborhood was alive with whispers, their faces glowing in the red-blue haze. Some looked at me with pity, others with awe, but I no longer cared. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the witness, the survivor, the one who had pulled back the curtain on their lies. Richard caught my eye as they carried him down the steps, his face twisted in rage. "You'll pay for this, Margaret!" He spat, his voice raw, broken. I met his gaze without flinching. "I already paid," I said quietly. 30 years of my life. Tonight, you pay." Claire turned her face away, sobbing into her hands. My son stood on the lawn, his fists clenched, his body rigid. He didn't look at them. He looked only at me, and in his eyes I saw something I hadn't seen in months. Recognition. He finally understood. As the fire truck doors slammed shut and the sirens carried them away, the crowd dispersed, murmuring into the night. I stood alone on the porch, the cool air brushing against my face. My body was tired, my soul heavy, but my heart was lighter than it had been in years. For the first time since the betrayal began, the silence belonged to me. By morning, the wildfire had already spread. It didn't matter that the firefighters had tried to maintain professionalism or that the police had told the neighbors to disperse. Word travels faster than fire when it carries the scent of scandal. By sunrise, half the neighborhood knew that Richard and Claire had been wheeled out of my home, fused together, crying and cursing like a grotesque cautionary tale. I woke to the hum of whispers outside my window. From my bedroom, I could see Mrs. Thompson leaning over her fence, whispering furiously to Mr. Ellis, who shook his head with wide eyes. Across the street, two teenagers scrolled their phones, giggling, one of them holding up a video clip I didn't even want to imagine. Within hours, the story would be more than gossip. It would be legend. The police had left me with questions, their faces caught between shock and restraint. "Ma'am," the officer had said last night, his tone stiff, "we'll need statements." But his eyes betrayed him, hungry to laugh, to repeat the absurdity to his colleagues the moment he was out of earshot. "They were stuck?" he had whispered to his partner, as though confirming he hadn't misheard. Yes, stuck, glued together by their own sins. By mid-afternoon, it wasn't just neighbors. Old friends began calling. Some cloaked their curiosity in concern. "Margaret, are you all right? We heard about Richard and Claire." Their voices trailed off, waiting for me to fill the silence with details. Others didn't bother hiding their glee. "Good Lord, woman," one of my co-workers from years ago laughed into the phone. "You'll never buy a drink in this town again. You've made history." I didn't confirm or deny. I let them imagine, let them chew on half-truths. After years of being silenced, I found power in withholding, in letting their imaginations do the work for me. That evening, my son came to me, his face gray, his eyes hollow. He sat at the kitchen table, hands trembling as he tried to find words. "Mom, I don't know how to process any of this." His voice cracked like a boy's again. "My wife, my father. How do I even face the world after this?" I reached across the table, covering his hand with mine. "You don't have to carry their shame," I told him softly. "They chose it. They built it. All you need to do is walk away." He swallowed hard, tears brimming. "Everyone knows. I can't escape it." "You can," I insisted, "because you're not them. And the whole town can see the truth now. Who betrayed who destroyed what. You're not the villain here, son. They are." He bowed his head, silent tears falling onto the wooden table. For the first time, he wasn't defending them. For the first time, he saw me not as the paranoid, bitter mother, but as the only one who had stood in the fire and survived. By nightfall, the wildfire leapt even further. A local blogger had posted about the scandal on Maple Street, vague enough to avoid names, but detailed enough that anyone nearby knew exactly who it was about. The comments section erupted with speculation, gossip, even mock sympathy. My phone buzzed nonstop, neighbors pretending to check in, strangers demanding details, family members out of state desperate for the story. I didn't answer most of them. I sat on the porch instead, listening to the quiet hum of crickets under the weight of a sky heavy with stars. For the first time in months, the silence didn't feel suffocating. It felt earned. I wasn't invisible anymore. My pain had been validated, witnessed, magnified until no one could deny it. They had called me paranoid, delusional, bitter. But now the world itself was my witness. The firemen, the police, the neighbors, even the strangers online. They had all seen. And once the truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. The wildfire was out of my control now, and that was exactly how I wanted it. Let the flames burn through every whispering corner of town. Let them consume Richard's reputation, Claire's false sweetness, the fragile lies they had tried to weave around me. I didn't have to spread the story anymore. It was spreading itself. And for the first time since the nightmare began, I smiled. The days that followed were like watching a slow-motion collapse of a building I had once lived in, but no longer called my own. The foundation cracked, the walls crumbled, and the wreckage belonged not to me, but to those who had built their lives on betrayal. Richard was discharged from the hospital 3 days after the firefighters had pried him and Claire apart. but the damage wasn't something a doctor could stitch shut. He came home with bandaged burns and bruises, his body intact but his reputation scorched beyond repair. The whispers followed him everywhere. At the grocery store, people turned their backs. At the hardware shop, clerks smirked when he walked in. Even the pastor of our church, a man who had baptized our son, shook his head when Richard tried to attend Sunday service. Claire fared no better. My son filed for divorce immediately, the papers delivered by a sheriff's deputy who looked almost apologetic handing them over. She moved back into her parents' house across town, but she couldn't escape the looks, the muttered words. Mothers pulled their children closer when she passed, as if infidelity were contagious. Friends she once entertained with manicured smiles stopped answering her calls. She became a ghost in her own circles, shunned by the very community she had once charmed. Financial ruin followed close behind. Richard lost his contract with the firm he'd worked for nearly 2 decades. Bad publicity, they called it, but everyone knew the real reason. No client wanted to shake the hand of the man who had humiliated his family so spectacularly. Claire, stripped of my son's support and her comfortable home, found herself working part-time shifts at a diner. The red dress she'd once worn so smugly at Richard's birthday now hung limp in the back of her closet, a relic of arrogance turned to ash. As for my son, the betrayal carved deep scars in him, but those scars became the start of his strength. He told me one night, his voice raw, "Mom, I thought I was blind. I thought you were exaggerating and I sided with her, with them, and now I see it all. I'll never forgive myself for not believing you." I touched his cheek, feeling the roughness of stubble that hadn't been there when he was a boy, and I said, "Don't carry their sins, son. You've already been punished enough. Learn, heal, and leave them behind." Slowly, he began to rebuild. He poured himself into work, into friendships that weren't tainted by lies. He stopped defending the indefensible, and little by little, I saw the boy I had raised emerge again, a man who had been broken but not destroyed. The community, too, shifted. Where once I had been pitied as the paranoid wife, I was now seen as the woman who had endured the worst and survived. Neighbors who had once avoided my eyes now stopped me at the mailbox, pressing my hand with quiet respect. "You're stronger than any of us knew," Mrs. Thompson said one morning. Mr. Ellis nodded beside her, adding, "Took guts to stand tall in the middle of all that." I hadn't expected their validation, but I welcomed it. For too long, I had lived in shadows of shame. Now, the light felt almost blinding. Richard tried, of course. He called, he begged, he shouted. "We can fix this," he said one night when he showed up at my doorstep, his bandaged hands trembling. "You can't just throw away 30 years. I looked at him, at the man I had once adored, the man I had cooked for, prayed with, slept beside, and I felt nothing. Not love, not longing, not even anger, just emptiness. He had hollowed me out long before I found the strength to hollow him in return. "You threw away 30 years, I said quietly. "I just lit the match so you could see the ruins." Then I shut the door, and for the first time in decades, it felt like closure. Claire never came near me. Not once. I think shame swallowed her whole. Last I heard, she'd left town, desperate for a place where her name wasn't whispered with disgust. Perhaps she thought she could outrun her sins, but betrayal is heavier than luggage. It follows you everywhere. For me, the aftermath wasn't ruin. It was rebirth. I redecorated the house, stripped it of the furniture that smelled like memories, painted the walls in colors I chose for myself. I joined a book club, went walking with neighbors, and even booked a short trip to the coast, something I had put off for years because Richard always said it was too expensive. For once, I didn't ask anyone's permission. At night, when I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, I thought about all I had lost and all I had gained. I no longer had a husband. I no longer had a daughter-in-law. but I had my son's respect again. I had my community's acknowledgement. Most importantly, I had my dignity, polished and unbroken, shining brighter than it had in years. The affair had been a storm, tearing apart everything in its path. But storms clear the air. They reveal what was rotten, what needed to be uprooted. And when the skies finally break, the ground beneath is ready for new life. That was my aftermath. Not just survival, renewal. The night everything finally settled, I found myself on the porch, watching the world fade into dusk. The street was quiet, the houses around me glowing with the warm hum of lamps. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't bracing myself for whispers or lies. I was simply breathing, alive in a way I hadn't been in years. I thought about the woman I had been before, the Margaret who cried into pillows, who begged for scraps of love, who doubted her own instincts because others told her she was paranoid. That woman had died the moment I decided I would no longer be their victim. And though the death of that self had been brutal, the rebirth was even more powerful. Richard had lost everything: his marriage, his reputation, his work. Claire had lost even more: the trust of her husband, the respect of a community, the chance to ever look me in the eyes again. And me? I had lost illusions. Painful as that was, I realized illusions are meant to be shattered. Truth, once it arrives, sets you free. I didn't want revenge to define me, though. Revenge had been the spark, the weapon I needed to reclaim my voice. But the true victory wasn't in watching them humiliated. It was in watching myself rise again, stronger, sharper, unbreakable. They had glued themselves together with betrayal. I had stitched myself back together with dignity. One afternoon, my son sat with me on that same porch, his eyes red from everything he'd endured. He whispered, "Mom, how did you survive it? How did you keep standing when everything fell apart?" I smiled, not bitterly, but softly. Because I had to. Because if I collapsed, they would have won. And because I finally understood that loving yourself is the only thing that keeps you alive when everyone else betrays you. He nodded, silent tears running down his cheeks. That was enough. Sometimes I still hear the echoes, the shouts, the pleading, the sound of firefighters cutting metal upstairs. But those echoes no longer haunt me. They remind me. They remind me that silence is the soil where betrayal grows, and truth is the fire that burns it down. To anyone listening to my story now, I ask you, what would you have done if you discovered your husband with your daughter-in-law? Would you have swallowed the humiliation in silence? Or would you, like me, have chosen to expose them under the harshest light possible? This isn't just my story. It's the story of every woman who has ever been called paranoid for sensing the truth, every wife who has been gaslit into silence, every mother who has been dismissed as bitter or crazy when she was simply fighting to be heard. To those women, I say this: your instincts are not your enemy. Your silence is. Tonight, as I close this chapter of my life, I no longer feel like the victim of betrayal. I feel like the author of my own rebirth. The storm is behind me, the air is clear, and the ground beneath my feet is solid again. I survived. I thrived. And I will never again apologize for demanding respect. So if my story made your heart race, if it made you remember your own scars, your own humiliations, I ask you to stand with me now. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Write the number 9 if you believe that dignity is worth more than silence. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that even the deepest betrayal cannot kill you if you refuse to stay down. Because at the end of the day, betrayal may burn you to the ground, but from ashes, you can rise. I did, and so can you.